Hello, and welcome to the next in a series of webinars that are offered by Exida Academy. These webinars provide information on various topics for industrial control and other areas of interest. This one today happens to deal with cyber certification and providing some practical guidance that is available to you in the IEC standard 62443. My name is David Johnson. I've been with Exida for about 5 years and have been in the software process industry for more than 30 at this point in a variety of different sectors. I do both training, deliver webinars, and work with various clients in certifying their products and systems. Exida is very much customer focused. We have, just to give you a brief description, there are a number of enterprise tools that can help you with both functional safety and cyber certification that we have. We work with lifecycle services and certification and provide a very rigorous methodology and rigorous assessment of both safety and cyber certification projects, and would look forward to working with you if you have an interest in either one of those. We are a global company. You can see there are locations and offices that we have all over the world. We do petroleum and various other refinery work in the US and Australia, a lot of alarm management in South America. In Europe, we have a significant presence in the automotive industry, Far East, alarm management. We work in the Gulf of Mexico with the petroleum industry. We're involved with power generation in the Far East, or the Near East, and specifically in Saudi Arabia. So we have presence and work with teams and projects all over the world. This is an example of a certification document. This happens to be for a controller. It's an individual device produced by ABB. We do both functional certification and safety certification of systems, products, various components, and also personnel certification. So what we're going to talk about today is trying to deal with and how to go about managing security breaches that you might experience as an organization or within your systems. Most often, security mitigations tend to be more reactive than proactive. What we'd like to do is establish here a framework or a methodology for you to be more proactive in dealing with security breaches. That more holistic approach for addressing security involves a brief overview of 62443 and its impact and guidance that's provided on individual products as well as systems. We'll take a look also at some trends in security vulnerabilities and breaches that have occurred. And actually the example breaches will show how specific guidance in 62443 may have helped prevent those breaches. By way of an overview, the 62443 is actually a whole family of cyber standards. There are some various parts of the standard deal with general terminology and glossary and overall compliance. Then there's a significant amount of guidance dealing with policies and procedures in terms of running organizations and guidance within organizations. At the specific system level, there's guidance, and also for the development of individual products or components. That last tier is actually the area that we'll probably spend most of the time discussing today. And specifically the 4-1, which discusses an entire process for developing products, what's known as a security development lifecycle, and also looking at key functionality that needs to be in products in order for them to be secure. These are also known as foundational requirements. 4-2 deals with foundational requirements for individual products. And if you go up one level and over, 3-3 discusses the same foundational products only as applied to entire systems. So there's slight difference between the two of them, but essentially the foundational requirements are the same for both components of the standard itself. So in looking at 4-1, there are 8 primary practices involved in the product or perhaps system development process. So these key practices start with security management and identifying within your organization a organizational structure and policies that will implement cyber guidelines and practices throughout your entire organization. This typically is something which is joined with an existing quality management system and adds cyber concepts and guidelines to that quality system. Certainly obtaining good security requirements is key. The 4-2 and 3-3 from a product and the system level provide much of that guidance. There are a variety of other means for developing security related requirements, perhaps independent of those that your particular product requires. Practice 3 discusses security by design. Just as you cannot test in security, you need to, or test in quality, let's say, you need to design in quality. And the third practice within 4-1 provides significant guidance on designing systems to be secure. A key concept there is defense in depth. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but basically it involves layers of protection that you build around your system to prevent attackers from being successful. Implementing the product, actually building it, coding it, implementation deals with secure coding standards, also making use of tools called static code analysis tools or static code analyzers. These are very valuable for ferreting out weaknesses in a design. Your compiler will check for the correct syntax, but you may be, although you may be correctly using the language, there may be dangerous things about the way in which you're implementing it. For instance, a static code analyzer will warn you if you have a go-to statement within your code. Typically, you want in any module a given entry and an exit point. You don't want to be vectoring off into other routines mid-module. You could wind up with memory leaks and other various problems. So static code analysis will flag things like go-to modules or other constructs which could be potentially dangerous or lead to vulnerabilities within the code. Security verification and validation testing is much like a standard development lifecycle, however, with the additional components of significant abuse case testing. Much of the abuse case testing centers around communications robustness. And there's a whole set of tools and guidance around conducting robustness testing on your communications. Typically through some sort of an internet connection is where attackers will attempt to breach a system, and often they rely on potentially unexpected behavior that the system exhibits when unexpected inputs arrive into that system. Communication robustness testing attempts to simulate those unexpected inputs and determines whether or not the system can manage them. We'll talk about other abuse case testing a little bit later on in the presentation. Management of security related issues. When you actually have a breach or discover a vulnerability, you need to carefully manage that, especially if you have a family of products and that vulnerability may exist in several different products. You also need to have policies and procedures in place in the event of an actual breach so that you can turn to these when some kind of an event occurs, and you'll have a process already in place to be able to address that. Security update management. This refers to secure means for not only updating code, patching code, transferring code from the build environment to the target environment, significant use of digital signatures and other secure means for making sure that code that's developed doesn't have extra code, let's say, inserted somewhere along the process by a hacker and then delivered into your target system. And then general security guidelines. These are instructions that you'll want to give to the end user in terms of making sure that the environment where the product or the system exists is in fact secure and all appropriate security related guidelines are being followed, such as making sure that the authentication roles and the ID information associated with various system users is put together in a logical fashion. Your network is constructed such that there are perhaps security zones or parts of your system that require higher level security than others, and there should be effective partitioning then between those security zones, different types of security zones. And this guideline needs to be well understood by your user community. So the development process we just discussed. Now, in terms of basic capabilities that your system needs to have, these are known as the foundational requirements. So certainly proper access control and use control are key requirements of any secure system, making sure that you properly manage your users, you dismiss users when they've left the organization, you have good procedures for onboarding or when individuals move within the organization that they receive the appropriate authentications to use systems, different security systems for their new job if they've moved around. Data integrity is clearly a very important part of, in terms of a foundational requirement. You need to make sure that any repositories that you have within your system, static data stores perhaps, are periodically checked to make sure that they haven't been altered. This is part of the detection philosophy. We want to not only try to prevent hackers from coming into the system, but if they're there, we also need to be able to detect them quickly. So that data at rest, as well as data that's in transit, data that's moving around in the system, secure data probably should be encrypted in some fashion. When you're communicating with the system, you want to have general encryption capabilities. This would be going from your individual product to other parts of the system or external to the system. Restricted data flow deals with network segmentation. There's a part of the standard 3-2, which you may have seen in the overview. We won't be talking about that too much today, but that's entitled Zones and Conduits. And what that does is provide guidance on establishing areas within your system of higher security and lower security. So obviously you want to put more protection around those high security areas, perhaps invest in additional encryption or additional firewalls and the like to be able to build that additional security around high security areas within your system. So the standard does do a very good job in providing guidance there. You want to be able to respond to any kind of breaches quickly, not only in terms of responding to let your customer base know, but responding in terms of cutting off any kind of communications that are associated with breach to prevent further data loss and rapidly respond to that event when it's discovered. There's also the 7th foundational requirement deals with resource availability, and this is dealing with things such as denial of service attacks. If you have perhaps a controller and you have determined that there's the potential for a denial of service attack on that controller, you would not want that attack to disrupt the basic control algorithms that are running within the controller. So in terms of designing the architecture of the controller, you'll want to make sure that those things are partitioned, such that if there is a denial of service attack, the communications does not keep the bandwidth required by the communications, does not keep your control algorithms or your control strategy from running. You may lose external communications, but your key control functionality still operates correctly. So again, this impacts the design of your system and building systems that can tolerate these attacks and yet still function correctly. So these are the 7 basic foundational requirements that individual products and components should have, as well as should be part of general system level design. So when securing devices, there are a couple of things that you want to make sure of. Within 4-1, you're basically answering the question, did you build it right? Did you follow secure development processes? Did you ensure that the device can withstand the communication robustness testing? And from a functional standpoint, following 4-2, is the appropriate security functionality present? So when securing devices or getting certifications for securing devices, these are the basic considerations: the life cycle, the robustness testing, and the foundational requirements. And meeting all 3 of those will enable you to get a certification of your device or your system. So let's look at some trends in security. There are a couple of different areas I'd like to talk about here. And not only will we talk about the various trends, but we'll look at potential countermeasures or ways in which you can protect yourself. So there certainly is a trend to the cloud, whether or not that's considered new technology or not, but it is in fact being more widely accepted as a repository, as a data store. So data stores are what attackers are after. They're trying to get that information. So people who, or organizations that manage cloud data, certainly are very concerned about their data being hacked, as well as users of that are concerned about that. So that is obviously a security concern. Blockchain technologies, probably most widely known by way of Bitcoin. These are changing the way in which data is managed and transferred between organizations. So again, when you have an area of sensitivity in the cloud, you have your data in communication between organizations, you have the security of that information transfer. These are potential points at which hackers can go after. So blockchain technologies and hardening them from a security perspective is also a trend, let's say. Artificial intelligence and automation and using those kinds of techniques in terms of detecting and automating security detecting breaches and automating security processes is not well defined as yet, but certainly an emerging area. And for all these areas, looking at the 4-1 standard and understanding the practices within that standard provides tremendous guidance in dealing with and developing that strong security mindset as you are developing these products or are involved with these technologies. Resource management is another key problem. You want to make sure resources are qualified, that any outsourcing that you're doing, and that you're not caught up in any kind of deceptive practices or internal attacks. 4-1 also does help here by providing guidance on determining competence and managing those resources. One thing comes to mind, perhaps if you're dealing with particularly sensitive areas, you'll want to make sure that the personnel, obviously, that are involved in those areas are well vetted, or perhaps you can use techniques like dual authentication. That actually would be one of the things that appears under the foundational requirements. But there are things that you can do in order to manage and help reduce the likelihood of internal attacks, processes that you can build within your system. And again, that guidance is available in 62443. Other trends, well, yes, and certainly there have been breaches, ransomware and data theft that have hit the news. And generally, if you can certify areas of your system, go through all parts or the applicable parts, let's say, of the 62443 standard, you can help significantly reduce these breaches. Doesn't guarantee that they won't happen, but it does help eliminate significant vulnerabilities that could potentially be built into your system. One particular aspect comes to mind, third-party software. Not only do you get the functionality, but you get all the bugs when you incorporate third-party software in your system. So 62443 offers guidance in dealing with vendors and recommendations of ways that you can help validate or make sure that the software that you are incorporating does have at least the same level of security that you're building into your own products. Perhaps you've heard of the Lockheed Martin kill chain. This actually was codified by Lockheed Martin, although it's been around for some time in a variety of different formats. This is kind of a distillation. It starts with reconnaissance, then weaponizing the attack itself, succeeding in delivering, then exploiting the system, installing the software, getting command of the installed software, and then actually building on those objectives. So if we look at each one of these, in terms of reconnaissance, 4-1 does make recommendations on reducing the attack surface specifically. This will reduce the number of ways in which hackers can, let's say, get into your system. So from that part of the kill chain, guidance does exist in 62443. Weaponization and delivery all deal with software getting onto the system, having good update procedures and capabilities in place will help reduce the likelihood that an attack could occur on your system based on dangerous or invalid software that is installed on your system. So guidance is provided there. Exploitation, we're actually starting to try to communicate. The attackers trying to communicate with the outside world. 4-1 does offer recommendations or guidance on monitoring communications within your system. If you have good communications monitoring within your system, you should be able to quickly recognize that there are unknown communications. Let's say the software which has been installed on your system is communicating out to some servers as it extracts information. If you have good monitoring techniques in place, you should be able to disrupt those communications quickly. Installation, again, deals with patch management, getting software onto the system. Command and control, this deals with attempting to exploit more vulnerable areas than others within the system. If you have good network segmentation in place, you create additional barriers that attackers have to get through in order for their attack to be successful. And once they are in, if they are actively communicating, again, communications monitoring will help in terms of detecting the fact that an attacker has succeeded and therefore stopping that attack or taking immediate mitigation measures. So if we look at this kill chain, you can see that 62443 standard does provide guidance in each one of these areas that this is a general model for hackers to follow. This model was to some extent followed in the Stuxnet attack that occurred. So systems and environments that have are aware of 62443 and the guidance that it provides, you can put up additional barriers and perhaps make the attack so difficult that they ultimately fail. A key concept also is defense in depth. We actually mentioned this earlier. You want to build many, many layers around In this case, it's a control system or whatever asset you have that you want to be careful to protect. If you look there in the lower left, obviously the first barrier is a physical one. The system should be protected behind lock gates and special authorizations for personnel and that sort of thing. But you can go through establishing, as you go basically bottom up in this picture, policies and procedures being put in place. If you have networks that are set up, private networks and good network segmentation, obviously you have firewalls, perhaps some demilitarized zones. If you've developed a secure architecture, you've built security considerations into your system. Certainly account-based account management and role-based access all are key parts of providing security for an environment. And patch management, as we talked about, perhaps having virus scanners that look at the actual system as some kind of a detection mechanism. But you can see there for each one of these layers of protection, there are aspects of the 62443 standards that provide guidance for all of those. So again, that if you go to and understand what's in that family of standards, you can work to help build your own defense in depth strategy. So there are a number of technologies that are in parts of the whole security environment that are out there, but they're not as much of a concern as they were in the past. VPNs are widely used, but they're often difficult and inflexible. They can often be fragile. So there's work in progress in trying to develop those, but they don't rank as high in terms of urgent security issues as they once did. Certainly antivirus software, owners of these products recognize that they are very often the object of an attack. If you can shut down the antivirus in a system, you remove significant protections that system has. So those suppliers are taking more ownership of hardening their products against attacks. In terms of developing a repository of threats, this is something that really hasn't taken hold. It would be very valuable and educational to future security products or future security development efforts if such a repository existed. But it's very difficult to get data on the details of attacks on systems. You know, it's often embarrassing to organizations that their data has gotten out, so they tend to be a little bit play the cards close to the vest and don't really describe these attacks in complete detail. If there were a database of all these and each attack was well understood, then you could have a much more detailed list of specific examples of these kinds of attacks. There are databases of vulnerabilities, which we'll talk about in just a minute, where some of these things exist. So that's a start on getting a better understanding, but there's more work to be done there. Also, in terms of security specialists within environments, organizations are recognizing more and more that they need to develop significant capability within their environment in terms of security teams. So this is a well understood need at this point, so it's not quite as urgent as it once was. So then there are also the folks that believe that, well, their system's not connected to the network, I have an air gap, so I don't need to worry about security related issues. Well, you couldn't really be farther from the truth there. The air gap will provide protection against external attacks, but there still are internal issues and internal things that the 62443 standard provides guidance on. So your external threats are typically via an internet connection, but your internal threats could be mishandled, removable media. The Stuxnet attack was successful as a result of a USB drive that was found and plugged into a system. The USB drive was of unknown origin, but it got onto an operator's computer, which then he turned around and plugged in their system, and the virus was released. Anytime an employee connects to a system, if there's not good virus protection or good security practices in place with that computer could introduce problems within a system. And there are just careless mistakes that people make that cause security-related issues. And also the standard talks about training and competency and assessing the competency of employees on a regular basis to make sure that they really do know and understand the criticality of the work that they're doing. And then there's always the malicious employee. So this is actually a relatively low percentage of overall security attacks, but it is very often the most visible and the most damaging. So, they're looking for some kind of financial gain or revenge as an objective of their attack. So being able to manage the personnel and the competency, as we mentioned earlier, and assess as best as possible the likelihood that an attacker could be in your environment and not yet known. So being able to, that is certainly an internal threat. So just because you're air gap doesn't mean that you're not subject to potential security attacks. So if you kind of step back and look at your environments, an overall strategic approach certainly starts with promoting an overall security culture. So the 62443 really does, from a broad perspective, cover many, many aspects of security within an environment. So having a general understanding, training teams and members of your organization, and developing that overall security culture is a key starting point. Managing your patches and updates is certainly a very important component. If you've brought, let's say, open source code into your system, or you're using general products that have vulnerabilities, there are vulnerability databases, as we'll talk about in just a minute, that can help with that. But that's a key part of clamping down on potential ways in which your systems can be breached. Developing good best practices is another very important guidance in the 62443 standard. So there are good design, good coding practices, good requirement management practices, guidance in those documents for dealing with all of those. You also want to make sure that your internal policies are focused on security and dealing with things that can occur, such as managing portable media or guidance on vetting new personnel. This kind of information is available within the standard. And then obviously making sure that you look in detail at the various products or systems that you're involved with, and at the very least make sure that they address the 7 foundational requirements. So that's kind of an overall, bullet point list of things that you'll want to do as an organization from a high level to really address security. So in terms of promoting security culture, as we mentioned, it is a key topic in security discussions. Things all come up. We want to be able to change the environment to increase that awareness, take classes, have discussions on this, review papers and attend webinars such as this one to increase awareness. In general, mitigation in terms of getting a security culture, or the best way to do that, some guidance is provided in the 2-4 standard, which is another one of the standards within the family. There are specific discussions on solution staffing, skill assessment, background checks, making sure that employees are trained and their competencies are assessed, and then overall resource management, making sure that, again, things like when an employee leaves, that immediately all of their security authentications are removed from the system. So if we look at the next general area there, dealing with patches and updates, we mentioned before security management process. you want to have one of those in place. Make sure that as part of that, you're using resources that are available on the internet, such as ICAS CERT advisories, the NIST vulnerability database. There is a tool called Black Duck, and there are others that do things like look at open source code and other applications to make sure that within your build environment, and this Black Duck can be incorporated into a build environment, that your environment is using the most recent versions of code and there are no vulnerabilities that you are integrating or building into your system. Any third-party software may come with all the functionality that you need, but it also comes with vulnerabilities that may not have been designed out or corrected in that software that you're incorporating. To this end, there are tools like Nessus and Metasploit, which access these databases and can provide additional automation in terms of checking for vulnerabilities. So these all need to be part of your overall build environment. And again, more details are available in the 4-1 section of the standard and the 2-4 section in terms of mitigations that will help you manage your patches and updates. Good engineering practices. You want to make sure that the designers have these practices incorporated into their work processes and guidance. The whole concept of secure design should be something which is ingrained in all parts of your organization. There are guidance to procedures for teams that are available, things like good network design, using tools like a threat modeling tool as part of your design analysis. These are all general practices and guidance that need to be incorporated in, and a lot of this guidance is available in the 4-1 portion of the standard. So as a mitigation, a way of dealing and establishing good engineering practices, again, 62443 provides significant guidance. There is also significant guidance available in the standard in terms of developing that strong security culture and guidelines on work procedures and everyday activities, and 4-1 in their security management planning and developing that security management processes. There is significant guidance within the standard. And then certainly making sure that your devices all have the foundational requirements and the elementary functionality built into their systems. So what we'll look at here is a couple of examples of where had the organization made use of the guidance which is currently available in the 62443 standard, these attacks may not have occurred, or at least things would have been much more difficult for a hacker. So everybody's aware of Target and the loss of credit card information and personal data from the Target databases. Again, for all these breaches, there were a whole series of steps that the hackers had to go through, to some extent following that kill chain model, but a few of those steps are listed here. So the main entry point for the Target breach came through a third-party supplier. 4-1 specifically has sections on supplier management. So in this case, it wasn't code that you were receiving from that supplier, but authentications that you were granting to the supplier. They were not properly managed. The supplier did not properly manage their own internal authentications, so the hacker was actually able to get in through that third party. There was a vulnerability in the corporate server that had not been updated. This was a known vulnerability that had been published in ICAS CERT. Their management did not regularly check the database, so was not aware of the vulnerability. So as a result, the hacker was able to exploit that. So had Target had these good patch management practices in place, that software would have been quickly updated and would have likely prevented at least that avenue of the attacker from getting into the system. So let's look at another one here, Triton. This is a safety controller developed by Schneider. A safety controller is a device that basically watches a dangerous process and has the capability of shutting that process down should things occur that are potentially dangerous. So this breach actually did use many of the parts of the kill chain process. There was problems that they had in terms of their overall architecture. In this case, it was separation of their safety systems from their basic control systems. They were a little bit too tightly integrated, which allowed the hacker to move between the two of them. The access management, again, foundational requirement, was not sufficiently secure. The hacker was able to get around that. And then as a result, the hacker was actually able to install some patches and some software into the system. So having good patch management in place or detection mechanisms, had unexpected software being installed in the system would have helped discover this much more quickly. Everybody's familiar with the outages, of power outages that occurred in Ukraine as a result of Russian hacking. The outages actually were relatively short, but it did actually they did succeed in overriding some remote sites, and it took them quite a while to get those restored. They actually took control of an operator workstation and manually shut the power off. In Ukraine, much of the power grid is manual, but in the United States, a lot of it's automated. So if a similar kind of attack had occurred here in the States, there may have been actually much more success on the part of the hacker in terms of shutting down larger areas of the power grid. Most of this occurred, most of their attacks were successful as a result of phishing attacks to get user credentials. So here's a matter of education, competency, training on the part of the users, setting up good multi-factor authentication in terms of getting into the system, all things that are described as part of the foundational requirements, or actually discussed also in a little bit greater detail in the 2-4 portion of the standard. And then the federal workers HR database, where they lost employee data, addresses, social security numbers, and the like. This was tied to a China attack, and they are identified as advanced persistent threats. They're always coming after stuff within the US, although they deny it. There's just too much evidence that they are nosing around in US systems as a result of research that's been done by the National Security Administration, the NSA. When this attack occurred, they really realized that there were more than 15,000 machines that were all interconnected, and the design and the system architecture was not solid. There were a lot of holes, and they actually discovered 2,000 pieces of malware. So they actually had been over-focused on preventing attack and didn't really look at detecting attacks. So it was actually months and months after this attack had occurred and was successful that they actually discovered it. So they didn't have good detection mechanisms in place. So this breach, among other things that were part of the overall attack pattern, was able to obtain user credentials and get in through stealing those credentials. 2-4 and the foundational requirements in 4-2, better use and better management use of those guidelines would have helped prevent that. And they also had a very complex infrastructure. They also didn't have good overall cybersecurity management systems and standards and policies in place. All guidance that's available in 62443. So if they had paid attention to this kinds of guidance, it would have been much less likely that these attacks could have occurred. So if you are in fact looking for specific certification, of your devices or of your system or parts of your system, that general process involves certainly introductory kickoff meetings. A general gap analysis is done. Very often it's on site of your system or the products themselves. What's developed is a security case which goes through the applicable portions of the 62443 standard that will apply to the certification and collects evidence on those items. There's a certification process, making sure that all that information is correct, and then various reports and certificates are issued and they're posted. Exida has a portion of their website that lists all the system and product and personnel certifications that we've been involved with. There are also press releases as part of that process. It's not easy to get that certification. You know, you have to be clear on what the strategic motivation is. There clearly has to be high-level management support. This is not something that can be introduced at a mid-management level, because there are significant resources required to do these things. So there need to be dedicated resources, not just assignment of tasks, but allotment of time to perform those tasks. The process can take a while because, as we have noticed as we've gone through certification projects, that various things interrupt that process, so the client's kind of slow to respond. And very often there's a significant education process that's needed to make sure that the clients understand all of what's involved in doing certifications. So there is more information on our website. I encourage you to go there if that's something that you're interested in. So in terms of an overall summary, what we try to do is look at the 62443 entire family, break down various aspects of it, and try to see where that standard itself could have helped in terms of breaches and attacks that occurred on systems. We looked at some aspects of the current threat climate. It's constantly evolving. What 62443 tries to do is get down to fundamental parts and policies, design mechanisms, recommendations that are involved in the development of systems to cut off vulnerabilities and ways in which systems can be attacked. We talked about the need for cyber certification. We looked at some successful attacks and how they might have been avoided had organizations been aware of the guidance that's available in 62443. And we also talked briefly about what might be involved in doing the actual certification itself. So at this point, I'm going to check the questions, see if there are any questions that have appeared, and we'll go through those. I guess there's a statement that was made. The solution is simple: segregation of communications and no way to interrupt or inject in that communication. Not quite sure what they're getting after there. There may have been a particular slide that was introduced. Certainly communications are a key part of securing your system, but not the only aspect. There's also a question about human factors. So, I mean, the psychological aspects of what motivates individuals is often very difficult to determine. I know that the NSA, I have an associate who recently went into the NSA, and it took a year to go through and give him the appropriate security clearance. So the standard doesn't go as far as the NSA does in terms of vetting employees, but there is good guidance there in terms of understanding the capabilities of individuals and trying as best as practical to come up with ways in which you can determine whether or not these individuals are, potential security concerns at a future date. But also, in addition to that, building capabilities within your environment to prevent or help try to eliminate the probability that a single individual can attack the most vulnerable parts of your system. Obviously, if in order to get to a certain sensitive area, you require 2 individuals, then you'd have to have some kind of compliance for the attack itself to be successful. So there are mechanisms like that that can be put in place that may assist in terms of dealing with internal problems. Things like job rotation, let's say. So if you're moving individuals, every couple of months to different parts of your environment, and with them come different authentications, but previous authentication, let's say, are removed. So they may move from some sensitive areas to other sensitive areas, or perhaps areas that don't have any particular sensitivity. And as you rotate through those, you don't wind up having a single person have long-term access to a very sensitive system. So those are the questions that have appeared now. If any additional questions come to mind, here are a variety of ways in which you can contact exida through the social type medias of Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, or actually just go ahead and send email to Exida Academy. You can ask for me, Dave Johnson, or you can ask for anyone involved in security, and we'll do our best to get back to you as quickly as possible. There it is. There's a question here that popped up. How would you briefly compare the NIST life cycle to 62443? That is actually a very good question. We have done some comparison studies here. NIST has a tremendous amount of practical guidance also. The areas or emphasis of the organization and of the information you may find better suited to your particular organization. As many of these kinds of standards that you can incorporate, obviously the more of them, the more and broader understanding you'll have. I guess I can't point to specific things that NIST has that 62443 does not. They both have been aware of each other for many years and have incorporated or emphasized areas of the overall security culture, security processes in mind. So I would highly recommend looking at that one also. There is one other question here concerning how would DMZs be effective in preventing outside intrusions. Well, certainly if you have a DMZ in place, what a DMZ is access to regions of memory. So from the outside, on one side of your DMZ, you have external information which is stored in a database. And on the other side of your DMZ, you have a database that is accessible by your internal plant area network, let's say. And you have a single application that controls data transfer between the two of those. So there is no direct connection from outside to those internal databases. They all work through a connection. So DMZs are often used as means of isolating systems to provide protection against security breaches. So thank you very much for those questions. Again, if you have any additional ones or they come to mind, please contact us. We'd love to work with you and help you out with those. And please keep in mind, watch for future webinars that Exida has. I think we provide some pretty good information, and I think you can find that these webinars a valuable resource. Again, thank you very much for attending, and signing off for now.